hidden along the eastern shore of the Hudson River, where the water reflects centuries of American ambition and the cliffs whisper of old money and older secrets, stands a mansion that embodies the transformation of American aristocracy. Not a castle imported stone by stone from Europe, not a monument to industrial violence like some of its neighbors, but something perhaps more revealing, a Greek revival manor that watched America grow from young republic to Gilded Age empire, that hosted the architects of American finance, and that holds in its walls the story of how one family's wealth and influence shaped the nation itself. This is Mill's Mansion, and its story isn't just about architecture or affluence. It's about the invisible aristocracy that governed America from drawing rooms and estates rather than thrones and palaces, about the quiet power that shapes nations without ever needing to raise its voice, about a family that understood something most never grasped. That real power doesn't announce itself. It simply is. The year is 1832. Andrew Jackson is president, fighting his war against the Second Bank of the United States. America is young, rough, determinedly democratic. The old European model of hereditary aristocracy has been rejected. This is supposed to be a nation of equals, a country without lords and ladies. But along the Hudson River, something else is happening. A different kind of aristocracy is forming, not based on titles or bloodlines, but on land, commerce, and strategic marriages. And at the center of this emerging American gentry sits a family named Livingston. Morgan Lewis, a name that echoes with Revolutionary War heroism and political power, is building a country estate. He's already served as governor of New York, already established himself as one of the state's most influential figures. But this mansion isn't about power already held. It's about power to be consolidated, expanded, transmitted to future generations. The original structure was Greek revival, America's architectural language of democracy, ironically used to build monuments to wealth, clean lines, classical proportions, columns that reference Athenian temples. This was architecture that said, we may be a new nation, but we're the inheritors of Western civilization's greatest traditions. But here's where the story gets intriguing. The mansion wasn't built in New York City, where political power was exercised. It wasn't in Albany, the state capital. It was built on the Hudson River, on hundreds of acres of land that had been in the Livingston family since colonial times. Land that had been granted by royal charter, land that represented one of the largest and most influential estates in New York history. Why here? Why this specific location overlooking the river? Because the Hudson River Valley wasn't just scenic, it was strategic. This was the corridor connecting New York City to Albany, the route traveled by politicians, merchants, power brokers. Anyone of importance in New York State would pass by or through this region. The Livingston estates, and there were several, were like a constellation of power centers dotting the landscape. Having a mansion here meant you were part of the Hudson River aristocracy. The families, Livingston, Van Rensselaer, Schuller, and others who controlled vast tracts of land, who married each other's children, who shared political offices and business ventures among themselves. An American aristocracy that would have been horrified to be called such, but that functioned exactly like one. But Mill's Mansion, in its original 1832 incarnation, was modest by later standards. A comfortable country house, a rural retreat, not the palace it would become, because the real story of Mill's Mansion isn't about its beginning. It's about its transformation, about what happens when an old money estate is purchased by new money millions and remade into something that announces, rather than quietly assumes, its importance. The real purpose behind this structure wasn't immediately apparent in 1832. Morgan Lewis built a house appropriate to his station, prominent but not ostentatious, elegant but not excessive. The statement it made was subtle. I belong to the class that has always governed. I don't need to prove anything, but that would change. Because in America, old money eventually meets new money. And when it does, when the quiet assurance of inherited position encounters the aggressive confidence of self, made fortune, something fascinating happens. The mansion itself becomes a battleground of competing visions of what American wealth should look like. The location's significance went beyond social geography. The Hudson River Valley was and remains one of the most beautiful landscapes in America. The river itself is tidal this far north, meaning it flows both ways, an ancient highway that connected America's greatest port to its interior. Mountains rise on both shores. The light has a particular quality that attracted the Hudson River School painters, artists who saw in this landscape a kind of American Eden. To build here was to claim a piece of that beauty, to make it private property, to say this belongs to me. Not in the crude sense of posting no trespassing signs, but in the refined sense of creating an estate so perfectly integrated with the landscape that it seems to have always been there, natural and inevitable. The 1830 mansion was built during a period of relative optimism in American history. The Revolution was still within living memory. The War of 1812 had been survived. The nation was expanding westward. And for families like the Livingstons, who had bet correctly on independence and positioned themselves advantageously in the new republic, the future looked bright. Morgan Lewis was no ordinary builder. He was a man who had commanded troops, governed a state, married into the Livingston dynasty, and understood that in America, land was power. Not just economically, though the estate would have generated income through tenant farming, but socially and politically. The original construction timeline is less documented than later renovations, but Greek revival homes of this period typically took 2 to 3 years to build. The materials would have been local stone and wood crafted by skilled artisans who understood classical proportions. The design was likely conservative. These were people who valued restraint, who thought ostentation was vulgar, who believed good taste was knowing when you'd done enough. The estate occupied hundreds of acres along the Hudson. This wasn't just a house with a yard. This was a working agricultural property with tenant farmers, managed woodlands, productive fields. The mansion was the heart of a small economic ecosystem, a manor house in everything but name. But the first incarnation of Mills Mansion would stand for only 6 decades before everything changed. Because in 1895, Ruth Livingston Mills, descendant of that old Livingston line, inherited the property. And Ruth was married to Ogden Mills, whose family fortune came from banking, railroads, and Western mining operations. New money, lots of it. And Ogden Mills had ideas, the old Greek revival house, comfortable and appropriate for its time, no longer reflected his family's position in Gilded Age society. It needed to be more, bigger, grander, more impressive, not just a country house, but a statement. So in 1895, 1896, Ogden Mills hired the architectural firm of McKim, Mead White, the most prestigious architects in America, to completely transform the mansion. And transform they did. The Greek revival core was kept, but it became just the center of a much larger structure. Wings were added. A 3rd floor was built. The exterior was reclad in limestone. Classical details were added or enhanced. What emerged wasn't a renovation. It was a reimagining. The mansion grew to 65 rooms, spreading across 14,000 square feet of interior space. This wasn't just expansion. This was announcing that the Mills family belonged among America's greatest fortunes, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Rockefellers. McKim, Mead, and White were masters of Beaux-Arts classicism, the architectural style that combined French planning principles with classical details. They designed the Boston Public Library, the Brooklyn Museum, countless mansions for the ultra-wealthy. They knew how to create buildings that looked like they'd been standing for centuries, even when they were brand new. The challenges they faced weren't primarily technical. The firm was too experienced for that. But conceptual. How do you transform a modest Greek revival house into a Gilded Age palace without completely destroying it? How do you respect the original while overwhelming it with new grandeur? Their solution was elegant. They made the old house the core, the historical anchor, and built the new mansion around it like layers of new identity wrapped around an old self. The result was architecturally coherent but historically complex, a physical manifestation of how old money and new money can merge into something that's greater than either alone. The significance of the location remained what it had always been, Hudson River aristocracy, but now it had added significance. This wasn't just a Livingston estate anymore. It was a Mills estate. and the Mills family represented Gilded Age capitalism in all its glory and excess. The mansion became a statement that the Hudson River Valley wasn't just for old Dutch families anymore. It was for anyone with enough wealth to claim a piece of it. The original occupants of the 1832 mansion were Morgan Lewis, his wife Gertrude Livingston Lewis, and their family. Morgan was in his 70s when the house was built. This was meant to be his retirement estate, his reward for a life of public service and private success. But Morgan died just 2 years after the mansion was completed in 1844. Gertrude lived on in the house, maintaining it as a Livingston family property. And this is important: for 60 years, the mansion remained a Livingston holding. It passed through the family according to the careful marriage alliances and inheritance patterns that old New York families used to keep their wealth consolidated. The mansion during this period played the role it was designed for: a country seat of an established family. Summers would be spent here, away from the heat and disease of the city. Guests would be entertained, not lavish parties, but refined gatherings of like-minded families. Political discussions would happen in the library. Business arrangements would be discussed over cigars on the veranda. These early decades were quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because, for people of this class, drama was considered vulgar. You managed your affairs, maintained your position, raised your children to understand their responsibilities. You didn't make scenes. You didn't seek attention. You simply were. But underneath that quiet dignity, power was being exercised constantly. The Livingston family was deeply involved in New York politics, finance, and society. Having a Hudson River estate wasn't just about having a nice house. It was about being part of a network, an invisible aristocracy that governed through influence rather than title. Notable events, they wouldn't have been notable in the public sense. No balls that made the newspapers, no scandals that everyone whispered about. But in the private sense, everything that happened here was notable. Every guest who visited, every marriage alliance discussed, every political position negotiated. The mansion served exactly one function: private residence for a family that didn't need it to serve any other function. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They already belonged to the class that mattered. The house was simply appropriate to their station, neither more nor less than was proper. But all of this would change dramatically in 1895 when Ruth Livingston Mills inherited the property, because Ruth's husband Ogden had very different ideas about what a Hudson River mansion should be and do. After McKim, Mead, and White completed their transformation in 1896, Mills Mansion had become something entirely new. What had been a respectable Greek Revival country house was now a 65-room Beaux-Arts palace that could stand comparison with any of the great Hudson River estates and many European ones. The architectural style was unmistakably French-inspired, but with a distinctly American interpretation. The exterior, reclad in pristine white limestone, glowed against the Hudson Valley landscape. A grand port, Kochru announced visitors' arrival. The roofline bristled with dormers and chimneys. This was a house designed to be seen, to be admired, to announce that something important happened within its walls. But here's what's fascinating about the Mills transformation versus other Gilded Age extravagances. There was restraint. Yes, the mansion was grand. Yes, it was expensive, but it wasn't vulgar. McKim, Mead, and White and the Mills family understood something that many new money families didn't. That true elegance knows when to stop, that you could have a palace without making it look like a costume party. The entrance hall set the tone immediately. Not overwhelming, but impressive. Not gilded excess, but refined taste. Marble floors, classical columns. A grand staircase that ascended with grace rather than theatrical drama. This was a space that said, we belong here. We've always belonged here, even though the Mills' fortune was relatively new. The architecture suggested timeless permanence. The main floor contained the principal reception rooms, each designed for specific social functions. The drawing room, now known as the Oak Drawing Room, was paneled entirely in carved English oak, not American oak, English. Imported, installed, maintained at considerable expense. The paneling created a warm, masculine space perfect for the after-dinner gatherings where men would discuss politics and business, while the ladies entertained themselves elsewhere. The dining room was the mansion's showpiece. Designed to seat dozens for formal dinners, it combined French architectural details with English furniture traditions. The walls were covered in Fortney fabric, expensive hand-printed textiles from Venice. The ceiling featured elaborate plasterwork. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, their light reflected in polished mahogany and gleaming silver. But what made this room truly remarkable wasn't its size or decoration. It was what happened here. Because when you entertained at Mills Mansion, you weren't just hosting a dinner party, you were exercising power. Guest lists were strategic. Seating arrangements were political calculations. Conversations that seemed casual over dessert might determine banking policies or political appointments. The library occupied a central position on the main floor, significant because in houses like this, libraries weren't just for reading. They were power centers. Here, surrounded by leather-bound volumes in dark wood, serious conversations happened, treaties were negotiated, alliances were formed, futures were decided. The room itself lent gravitas to everything discussed within it. There were multiple parlors and sitting rooms, each with its own character and purpose. The music room housed a grand piano. The morning room caught Eastern light. The conservatory, a Victorian addition that survived the renovation, provided a space where tropical plants thrived year-round, a living reminder that wealth could command nature itself. The second floor contained family bedrooms and guest suites. Each guest room was individually decorated, furnished like small apartments. When you were invited to spend the weekend at Mills Mansion, you weren't just getting a bed. You were being housed in accommodations finer than most people's permanent homes. The color palette throughout was rich, but restrained. Deep reds, forest greens, warm golds. These were colors that complemented the architectural details without competing with them. The furniture was primarily Louis XV and Louis XVI French antiques. Ogden Mills shared his generation's obsession with French decorative arts. But there were also English pieces, American colonial furniture inherited from the Livingston side, oriental rugs layered on hardwood floors. The third floor, added during the renovation, housed servants' quarters and additional guest rooms. This vertical segregation was typical. The higher you went, the less important the occupants. But even the servants' rooms at Mills' mansion were more comfortable than working-class homes. The Mills family understood that good service required reasonable treatment. What made Mills Mansion architecturally significant wasn't innovation. McKim, Mead and White weren't revolutionaries. What made it significant was perfection of type. This was Beaux-Arts. Arts classicism executed flawlessly, demonstrating exactly what American wealth could achieve when guided by educated taste and unlimited resources. The mansion had no grand ballroom in the Vanderbilt sense. The Mills family wasn't interested in hosting hundreds. Their entertaining was more exclusive, dinners for 30, weekend house parties for a dozen families. Quality over quantity, influence over impression, but there were innovative features, subtle ones. The heating system was state of the art for 1896. Electricity throughout, though gas fixtures were maintained as backup. Multiple bathrooms with the latest plumbing, revolutionary for a country house. These weren't showcased, but they were there. Evidence that modern comfort coexisted with classical aesthetics. The interior design philosophy was consistent throughout. Create an environment where wealth was assumed rather than announced, where every detail was perfect, but nothing was ostentatious, where guests would be simultaneously impressed and comfortable. This was the architectural equivalent of old money manners, knowing exactly how to behave because you'd never known anything else. If the mansion's interior was about controlled elegance, the exterior grounds were about commanding landscape. Mills Mansion sat on approximately 192 acres of Hudson River waterfront, a massive estate even by Gilded Age standards. But this wasn't just acreage. This was carefully managed, meticulously maintained landscape architecture designed to create the impression that nature had conspired to make this place perfect. The immediate grounds around the mansion were formal, manicured lawns, geometrically arranged flower beds, gravel paths that directed movement and view. This was nature's decoration as proof of wealth's ability to impose order on the organic world. Gardeners maintained these spaces constantly, ensuring that spontaneity never intruded on design. But beyond the formal gardens, the estate transitioned to a more naturalistic landscape, the picturesque style that wealthy Americans borrowed from English landscape design. Here, lawns gave way to meadows. Formal paths became walking trails. Cultivated gardens became managed woodlands. The transition was seamless, creating the illusion that the entire landscape was naturally perfect rather than carefully constructed. The Hudson River itself was the estate's most dramatic feature. The mansion was positioned on a bluff overlooking the water, commanding views up and down the river. From the mansion's windows and terraces, you could watch boats passing, commerce and recreation moving along America's most historic waterway. The river wasn't just scenery. It was a living reminder of the region's importance, its history, its continuing relevance. The grounds included several outbuildings, each serving specific functions. A carriage house, later converted to house automobiles, stables for the horses that remained fashionable even as cars became practical, greenhouses where flowers were grown year-round for cutting and display, a gardener's cottage, an ice house, all the infrastructure required to maintain a Gilded Age estate. There were also recreational features, tennis courts, the sport of choice for the wealthy, paths suitable for riding, gardens designed for strolling, for taking air, for having private conversations away from the house. The grounds weren't just beautiful, they were functional, providing appropriate outdoor activities for guests who expected both exercise and elegance. The tree plantings were extensive and carefully considered. Ancient oaks that predated the mansion provided shade and gravitas. Elms lined drives, creating natural colonnades. Ornamental trees, Japanese maples, flowering dogwoods, exotic species provided seasonal interest and demonstrated the owner's botanical sophistication. But here's what's particularly interesting about Mills Mansion's landscape. It wasn't trying to compete with places like Biltmore or the Breakers. Ogden Mills wasn't building the biggest or most elaborate estate in America. He was building something appropriate to its location and history, a Hudson River estate that honored regional traditions while incorporating contemporary tastes. The landscape design respected the natural topography rather than trying to reshape it dramatically. The bluff's elevation was used to create drama. The slope down to the river was planted to frame views. Existing mature trees were incorporated into designs rather than cleared for new visions. This was landscape architecture that worked with nature rather than against it. There were no famous formal gardens in the European palace sense, no Versailles-style geometry stretching for miles, but there were beautiful, intimate garden spaces, a rose garden for cutting, a perennial border that provided color spring through fall, a kitchen garden that supplied the mansion's table with vegetables and herbs. The grounds also included working farmland, fields leased to tenant farmers who produced crops. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was economic. The estate supported itself partially through agricultural revenue, maintaining the tradition of Hudson River manors as working properties rather than purely ornamental ones. One of the most significant features was the estate's relationship with the surrounding community. Unlike some Gilded Age estates that isolated themselves completely, Mills Mansion maintained some connection with nearby Staatsburgh. The family employed local residents, purchased supplies from local merchants, participated selectively in local civic life. They were apart from the community, but not entirely separate. The historical significance of specific plantings is harder to trace. Unlike some estates, Mills Mansion didn't document every tree or garden design meticulously, but certain elements clearly date to different eras. Ancient trees from before the mansion, formal gardens from the 1896 renovation, later additions from the early 20th century as tastes evolved. What makes the Mills Mansion landscape enduringly important is how it represents a particular vision of American wealth, not the flashy excess of Newport cottages, not the massive scale of Biltmore, but something more regionally appropriate, historically aware, and ultimately more sustainable. These grounds could be maintained. These designs could endure. This was landscape architecture built to last. The most dramatic renovation in Mills Mansion's history was, of course, the 1895-1896 transformation by McKim. Mead and White. But that wasn't the end of the mansion's evolution. Buildings this significant in families this wealthy are constantly being refined, updated, maintained. After the 1896 renovation, the mansion settled into a period of stability. Ogden, Mills, and Ruth lived there seasonally, primarily using it as a summer estate while maintaining residences in New York City and later in California. During this period, changes were incremental, updating technologies, refreshing fabrics, maintaining rather than transforming. Ogden Mills died in 1929, just months before the stock market crash that ended the Gilded Age. Ruth survived him by almost 30 years, dying in 1920. Their son, Ogden Livingston Mills, inherited the property, and Ogden Jr. was no idle heir. He was a serious man with serious political ambitions, serving as Undersecretary of the Treasury and then Secretary of the Treasury under President Herbert Hoover from 1932 to 1933. During Ogden Jr.'s ownership, the mansion took on new significance. It wasn't just a family estate. It was a retreat for high-level government officials, a place where fiscal policy was discussed, where responses to the Great Depression were debated. Treasury officials and political figures would visit, conducting government business in an environment far removed from Washington's pressures. But Ogden Jr. never married, and when he died suddenly in 1937 at age 54, the question of the mansion's future became urgent. His sister, Gladys Livingston Mills Phipps, inherited the property. But Gladys had her own estates, her own life, and maintaining Mills Mansion with its 65 rooms, its extensive grounds, its constant need for staff, and upkeep was becoming impractical even for the very wealthy. The world had changed. The Great Depression had shifted attitudes toward ostentatious wealth. World War II was approaching, bringing material shortages and changed priorities. The era of grand private estates was ending. Families were looking for ways to preserve these properties while relieving themselves of impossible maintenance burdens. And in 1938, Gladys Mills Phipps made a decision that would define Mills Mansion's future. She donated the property to New York State. This wasn't abandonment. It was strategic preservation. Gladys understood that private ownership was no longer viable for estates of this scale. But she also understood that Mills Mansion represented something worth saving, a piece of American architectural and social history that deserved to endure. New York State accepted the donation, recognizing the mansion's significance. But accepting a gift like this isn't simple. The state inherited not just a beautiful building, but a massive responsibility. The mansion needed constant maintenance. The grounds required professional care. Climate control systems had to be installed to protect furnishings. Security was essential. In the years following the donation, New York State Parks worked to stabilize the property. Unlike some historic houses that are stripped of their original furnishings and refurnished with period pieces, Mills Mansion retained much of its original contents. The family donated not just the building, but many of the furnishings, the French antiques, the tapestries, the decorative arts. This made Mills Mansion unusually authentic as historic houses go. The first major state-sponsored renovation came in the 1940s and 50s, focusing on infrastructure. Heating systems were updated, electrical systems were modernized, plumbing was repaired, the roof. Always the first line of defense for any historic building was meticulously maintained. These weren't glamorous improvements, but they were essential. In the 1960s and 70s, attention turned to interior restoration. Paint analysis revealed original color schemes that had been painted over. Wallpapers were reproduced based on fragments found behind baseboards. Fabrics were researched and replicated. The goal wasn't to make the mansion look new, but to return it to its 1896 appearance, the height of its Gilded Age glory. The most significant challenge in all these renovations was balancing preservation with public access. Historic houses face a constant tension. Visitors are essential for relevance and funding, but visitors also cause wear. Every foot crossing a floor, every hand touching a railing, every breath adding humidity, all of it accelerates deterioration. New York State's solution was thoughtful restriction. Most rooms are visible, but not fully accessible. Visitors can look into spaces but can't touch furnishings. Certain areas with particularly fragile elements are viewed through doorways only. It's a compromise between preservation and access, not perfect, but necessary. Throughout the decades, various rooms have been closed, studied, restored, and reopened. The dining room underwent extensive textile conservation in the 1980s. Those Fortuny fabrics were deteriorating, and specialists spent months carefully stabilizing them. The oak drawing room's paneling required expert cleaning and preservation. The entrance hall's marble floors needed careful maintenance to prevent cracking. What prompted each renovation wave was usually a combination of necessity and opportunity. Roofs don't ask permission to leak, but grant funding comes and goes, requiring projects to be timed strategically. The state had to balance Mills Mansion's needs against dozens of other historic sites, all competing for limited preservation dollars. What wasn't altered, what New York State has been remarkably careful to preserve, is the mansion's essential character. Unlike some state historic sites that feel like museums, Mills Mansion still feels remarkably like a house where extraordinarily wealthy people lived, yes, but a house nonetheless. You can imagine people actually inhabiting these spaces, not just displaying them. One significant modern addition, the visitor center and administrative facilities were carefully placed in outbuildings rather than within the mansion itself. This preserved the main house's architectural integrity while providing necessary infrastructure for museum operations. It's the kind of thoughtful compromise that characterizes good historic preservation. The grounds have also evolved under state management. While the extensive acreage remains, the intensive formal gardens of the Gilded Age couldn't be maintained without full-time gardening staff. So the landscape has been simplified somewhat, still beautiful, still historically appropriate, but sustainable within Parks Department budgets. In recent decades, there's been renewed focus on interpretation. How do you explain this place to visitors? Do you celebrate Gilded Age luxury or critique inequality? Do you focus on architectural achievement or labor conditions that made such wealth possible? Mills Mansion has gradually incorporated more nuanced interpretation, acknowledging both the artistry and the social context of what they're preserving. Technology has also transformed the visitor experience. Climate control protects artifacts while remaining invisible. Lighting preserves historic fixtures while adding modern, museum-quality illumination. Security systems protect against theft without marring interiors. All the infrastructure a modern historic site requires, carefully integrated to minimize visual impact. The most recent major work focused on accessibility. Historic houses, built for able-bodied wealthy people, are notoriously challenging for visitors with mobility limitations. Ramps have been added where possible. Alternative viewing angles created. Virtual tours developed for areas that can't be made physically accessible. It's ongoing work, balancing historic authenticity with contemporary values of inclusion. Unlike some Gilded Age mansions with scandalous histories, Mills Mansion's dark secrets are more subtle, more systemic, less about individual misdeeds than about the structure of inequality itself. The Mills fortune, like many Gilded Age fortunes, was built on ruthless capitalism. The family's wealth came from banking, railroads, and Western mining, industries notorious for labor exploitation, dangerous working conditions, and environmental devastation. While Ogden Mills himself wasn't directly responsible for mining disasters or railroad strikes, his wealth was extracted from systems that consumed workers' lives with the same efficiency they extracted ore from mountains. The banking operations that enriched the Mills family involved financing ventures that displaced indigenous peoples, exploited immigrant labor, and concentrated wealth in ways that would eventually require progressive-era reforms and New Deal intervention. The mansion on the Hudson was paid for by workers in Western mines who never saw a fraction of such luxury, who died young from silicosis and accidents, whose families lived in company towns under conditions that bordered on feudalism. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. It was all legal, all proper, all within the accepted practices of the time. The Mills family didn't break laws. They just benefited from a system structured to channel wealth upward, to treat labor as a commodity rather than as human beings, to value profit over people. The mansion itself was built and maintained by servants whose lives were entirely subordinated to their employer's comfort. The third, floor servants' quarters, considerably nicer than most working-class housing, but still segregated, still controlled, still requiring constant labor and service to others' leisure. These weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. Not really. Economic necessity bound them to service in ways that limited their life choices as effectively as any legal constraint. There are stories documented in household accounts and employee records of servants who worked at Mill's mansion for decades. Entire lives spent maintaining someone else's comfort. Is that a tragedy? It was considered normal, even laudable. Long service was a mark of good character. But from another angle, it's a life sacrificed, potential unrealized dreams deferred so that wealthy people could live in perfect elegance. The grounds were maintained by gardeners who worked year-round in all weather. The kitchen operated with the military precision of a restaurant, producing elaborate multi-course meals multiple times daily when the family was in residence. The laundry, acres of fine linens that required hand washing, careful starching, precise ironing, was done by women whose hands were perpetually red and raw. None of this was secret exactly. It was just invisible, the same way workers are invisible to the wealthy today. Present but not seen, essential but not acknowledged. The dark secret isn't a specific scandal. It's the systematic erasure of the labor that made such lives possible. There's also the environmental cost, though this wasn't understood as problematic in the Gilded Age. The estate was carved from wilderness. Ancient forests were cleared. Natural waterways were redirected for drainage and irrigation. Local wildlife populations were disrupted. Gardens were planted with exotic species that required constant intervention to survive. This was landscape-dominated, controlled, made to serve aesthetic rather than ecological purposes. The social cost was similarly invisible. The Mills family and their peers controlled enormous resources, land, capital, political influence. This wasn't just wealth, it was power. Power to shape communities, determine economic opportunities, influence who succeeded and who struggled. And that power was exercised primarily in the interests of their own class, maintaining systems that benefited them regardless of cost to others. There's a specific darkness in Ogden Livingston Mill's Jenner's political career. As Treasury Secretary during the early Depression, he advocated for policies that prioritized fiscal discipline over relief for suffering Americans. His approach, balanced budgets, hard money, limited government intervention, sounded responsible but meant real hardship for millions. He wasn't cruel, just ideologically committed to ideas that treated economic suffering as necessary and temporary rather than as preventable and urgent. From his Hudson River estate, he could advise letting the market correct itself, letting weak businesses fail, letting unemployment run its course. Because he'd never been unemployed, never worried about feeding his family, never experienced the desperation that his policies created or prolonged. That disconnect between the maker of policy and the victims of policy is its own kind of darkness. There are also quieter tragedies. The pressure on family members to maintain appearances, fulfill social obligations, live up to inherited expectations. Ruth Livingston Mills devoted her life to managing households, orchestrating social seasons, maintaining the complex machinery of Gilded Age entertaining. Was that fulfilling, or was it exhausting performance, a life of relentless social obligation masquerading as privilege? Ogden Jenner never married, dying at 54, seemingly consumed by work and responsibility. Was that dedication to public service, or was it the toll of trying to live up to impossible expectations, to manage inherited wealth and influence while watching the world his class had built crumbling around him? The mansion has no ghost stories in the traditional sense, no spectral figures wandering halls, no unexplained phenomena. But there's something haunting about walking through rooms where such extreme wealth was casually displayed, where a single chandelier cost more than a working family's lifetime earnings, where beauty was purchased without thought for what that purchase cost others. The real darkness isn't supernatural, it's historical. It's the recognition that this beauty, this elegance, this architectural achievement was built on a foundation of systematic inequality that we haven't fully escaped even now. The same dynamics that created Gilded Age fortunes still lie, perhaps more subtly, perhaps more globally, but fundamentally unchanged. The ownership history of Mills Mansion is, in many ways, the story of American aristocracy itself, its formation, its peak, its transformation into something else. The property began as Livingston family land, granted by British royal charter in colonial times. This wasn't property purchased on an open market. This was land granted by Crown authority, creating a kind of American nobility that existed before the nation rejected nobility as a concept. Morgan Lewis acquired this specific parcel through marriage. He married Gertrude Livingston, bringing him into one of New York's most powerful families. The 1832 mansion was built on what was essentially dynastic land property that had been Livingston territory for over a century. When Morgan died in 1844, the property passed to Gertrude and through her to her descendants. For the next 5 decades, it remained a Livingston family holding, passed through inheritance patterns that kept it within the extended family network. This was how American aristocracy worked, not through formal titles, but through marriage alliances, inherited property, and social networks that functioned like European aristocracy without the legal framework. The transformative moment came in the 1890s when Ruth Livingston inherited the property and brought her husband Ogden Mills into ownership. This represented the merger of old New York money with New California Wall Street money. It was a pattern repeated throughout the Gilded Age. Old families with land and lineage, but declining fortunes, marrying new families with vast wealth, but social insecurity. Ogden Mills, through his marriage to Ruth, gained social legitimacy. Ruth gained the financial resources to live in a manner her ancestors couldn't have afforded. The 1896 mansion renovation was the physical manifestation of this merger. Old family property transformed by new family money into something greater than either alone could have created. Ogden Mills Sr. died in 1929. Ruth died in 1920. Their son Ogden Livingston Mills inherited the property around 1929-1930 at precisely the moment when the world such estates represented was collapsing. Ogden Jr.'s ownership coincided with the Depression, the New Deal, and dramatic shifts in American attitudes toward wealth. The mansion went from symbol of success to potential symbol of excess. Ogden Jr.'s political prominence meant the estate remained relevant. It hosted government officials and important policy discussions, but the social season that had defined its earlier purpose was fading. When Ogden Jr. died unmarried in 1937, the property passed to his sister Gladys Livingston Mills Phipps. Gladys was married to Henry Carnegie Phipps. Note that last name. She was already connected to another industrial fortune. She had her own estates, including a massive horse farm in Old Westbury, Long Island. She didn't need Mills Mansion. More importantly, by 1938, maintaining such properties was becoming nearly impossible. Staff was harder to find and more expensive. Taxes on large estates were increasing. Social attitudes were shifting against ostentatious displays of wealth. The practical and political calculus all pointed toward the same conclusion: donate the property. Gladys's 1938 donation to New York State was both generous and pragmatic. Generous because she could have sold it. There was still a market for such properties, though diminishing. Pragmatic because state ownership ensured preservation while relieving her of unsustainable expenses. It was also good publicity, positioning the family as public, spirited citizens rather than out-of-touch plutocrats. New York State's acceptance created Mills Mansion as a state historic site. Part of the Staatsburgh State Historic Site, this transformation from private residence to public property represents a broader pattern. Many Gilded Age estates ended up as museums, parks, or institutions, their private purpose obsolete, but their historical significance recognized. The state ownership brought different challenges. Politicians and bureaucrats now made decisions instead of family members. Budgets were subject to legislative appropriation rather than personal wealth. The mansion had to justify its existence through visitor numbers, educational value, and public benefit rather than simply being someone's home. Over the decades, various government administrations have treated the mansion differently. Some governors and Parks Department commissioners prioritized historic preservation, increasing funding and attention. Others saw historic sites as lower priority, cutting budgets and staff. The mansion's condition and interpretation have waxed and waned accordingly. Famous figures connected to Mills Mansion include not just the family members, but also their guests. Herbert Hoover visited when Ogden Jr. was Treasury Secretary. Various robber barons and their descendants came for weekends. Artists of the Hudson River School painted the landscape. The guest books read like a who's who of Gilded Age America. The political significance was real but quiet. This wasn't where presidents announced policy, but it was where influential people discussed ideas, formed alliances, shaped the political landscape through informal conversations that never appeared in official records. That kind of power, social power, network power, dinner party power, was the Hudson River aristocracy's specialty. Cultural icons associated with the property are fewer. This wasn't a literary salon or artistic colony. The Mills family were patrons of established culture rather than avant-garde innovators. They collected art but didn't commission revolutionaries. They appreciated music but preferred classical to experimental. Their cultural contribution was preservation and display rather than creation. Today, Mills Mansion exists in a fascinating state between past and present, museum and monument, preserved history and living educational resource. It's operated by the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation and Historic Preservation as the Staatsburgh State Historic Site, though most people still call it Mills Mansion because that name carries the weight of history and personality that bureaucratic designations lack. The mansion opens seasonally for guided tours, typically from April through October when weather permits comfortable visiting. This seasonal schedule mirrors, intentionally or not, the original pattern of use. The Mills family used it primarily as a summer estate, and so do modern visitors, though for different reasons. Tours are structured to showcase different aspects of the mansion. The standard tour takes visitors through the main public rooms, the entrance hall, the dining room, the oak drawing room, the library. Guides, trained in both architectural history and social history, contextualize what you're seeing. This isn't just a beautiful room, it's a space where specific social and economic power was exercised. The interpretation has evolved significantly over the decades. Early tours focused primarily on architectural features and decorative arts. Look at this beautiful paneling, admire these French antiques. More recent interpretation includes discussion of the labor required to maintain such properties, the sources of Gilded Age wealth, the social dynamics of class and service. This shift reflects broader changes in how we approach historic preservation. Museums increasingly recognize that telling only the owner's story is incomplete. The servants who made this lifestyle possible, the workers whose labor created the wealth, the broader social and economic context, all of that matters for understanding what these places really represent. The mansion is no longer privately owned in any sense. It belongs to the people of New York State, held in public trust. This means funding comes from state budgets, entry fees, and donations from friends, groups, and preservationists. Modern amenities have been carefully integrated. Climate control protects temperature-sensitive furnishings and artwork. Modern lighting illuminates rooms while preserving historic fixtures. Security systems protect against theft and vandalism. Fire suppression equipment stands ready. Accessibility ramps provide entry for visitors who couldn't navigate the original entrances. All of this infrastructure is essential but deliberately invisible or minimal to preserve aesthetic integrity. The grounds remain beautiful but simplified from their Gilded Age glory. The formal gardens nearest the house are maintained, but not with the intensive labor they originally received. The rest of the landscape is managed as parkland. Mowed meadows, maintained paths, preserved views, but not the elaborate garden rooms and exotic plantings that required full-time horticultural staff. One particularly successful modern adaptation is the events program. The mansion hosts concerts, lectures, educational programs, even occasional period dinners where visitors can experience something approximating Gilded Age dining. These programs generate revenue while making the mansion feel alive rather than embalmed. School groups visit regularly, using the mansion as a living textbook for American history, architecture, social studies. Students learn about the Gilded Age not through textbooks alone, but through direct encounter with physical spaces where that era's drama played out. It's experiential education at its best, history you can see, touch, walk through. The mansion has also become a venue for historical research. Scholars study everything from architectural techniques to servant employment patterns to textile conservation. The property isn't just preserved, it's actively studied, generating new knowledge about Gilded Age America that enriches interpretation for future visitors. Weddings are occasionally held on the grounds, not in the mansion itself, but in the gardens or nearby facilities. This creates some controversy among purists who see it as commercialization, but it also builds community connections and generates revenue. And there's something oddly appropriate about the grounds designed for elite social performance being used for contemporary social celebrations. The visitor center includes a small museum with artifacts that can't be displayed in the mansion itself, rotating exhibits on various aspects of site history and educational materials for different age groups. It's housed in outbuildings to avoid impacting the mansion's historic integrity. Current amenities for visitors include parking, restrooms, a small gift shop, and picnic facilities. The surrounding state park offers hiking trails with spectacular Hudson River views, allowing visitors to experience the landscape beauty that made this location so desirable. The mansion engages actively with social media, sharing behind the scenes preservation work, archival photographs, historical research, and seasonal beauty. This digital presence extends the site's reach far beyond those who can physically visit, creating a global audience for what might otherwise be a purely local attraction. Partnerships with other Hudson River historic sites create a regional heritage tourism network. Visitors often tour multiple estates: Mills Mansion, Hyde Park, the Vanderbilt Mansion, Montgomery Place, Olana, creating an understanding of the Hudson River Valley as a cohesive cultural landscape rather than isolated properties. The COVID-19 pandemic forced adaptation. Virtual tours were developed. Outdoor programming increased. Timed entries and capacity limits changed the visitor experience. Some of these pandemic-era innovations have become permanent, improving access for those who can't visit in person while managing preservation challenges. So, what does Mills Mansion mean today? What can we learn from this monument to a vanished era, this perfectly preserved specimen of American aristocracy? The mansion's impact on the surrounding community of Staatsburgh and the broader Hudson River Valley has been profound and multifaceted. Economically, it's a heritage tourism anchor, drawing thousands of visitors annually who spend money at local businesses. The mansion doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a regional cultural economy built on history, landscape, and preservation. But the impact goes deeper than tourism dollars. Mills Mansion serves as a community gathering place for concerts, lectures, and events. It's a source of local pride. This magnificent property isn't privately gated anymore. It belongs to everyone. Former servants' descendants sometimes visit, reclaiming family stories that were marginalized in earlier interpretations. The educational impact is immeasurable. Generations of New York students have visited Mills Mansion as part of their history curriculum, gaining understanding of the Gilded Age that goes far beyond textbook descriptions. They see physical evidence of extreme wealth inequality, and hopefully they think about how that inequality was created and whether it's really so different from today's disparities. The mansion is absolutely still a symbol of power and prestige, though what that symbolizes has shifted. It no longer represents the power of the Mills family. They're gone, their influence diminished. Instead, it represents the power of the Gilded Age itself. That transformative and troubling period when America industrialized rapidly, created unprecedented wealth, and failed to distribute it equitably. It also symbolizes the power of preservation. The decision by Gladys Mills Phipps to donate rather than destroy or privatize created something that transcends her family's story. It proves that historic preservation can democratize history, making what was once exclusive accessible to all. The mystery that remains isn't supernatural or scandalous. It's philosophical. How do we reconcile our appreciation for beauty with our recognition of the inequality that created it? Can we walk through these magnificent rooms, admire the architecture and artistry, and simultaneously hold space for discomfort about the system that made it possible. Mills Mansion teaches us that history is complicated, that things can be simultaneously beautiful and troubling, that appreciating architectural achievement doesn't require us to celebrate the social structure that produced it, that we can learn from the past without romanticizing it. What we learn from its history is that American democracy has always coexisted with American aristocracy. We rejected formal titles and legal class structures, but we created informal ones just as powerful. The Hudson River families weren't officially nobles, but they functioned as such, controlling resources, wielding influence, passing power through generations. We learned that landscapes are political. Who gets to enjoy Hudson River views? Who decides how land is used? Mills Mansion's transformation from private estate to public park represents a more democratic distribution of access to beauty, even if the distribution of wealth hasn't changed nearly as much. We learn about the relationship between wealth and culture. The Mills family used art collecting and architectural patronage to legitimize their fortune and elevate their social standing. Does that make their contribution less valuable? Or does it prove that even questionable motivations can produce public benefits? We learn about preservation's purpose. Why save buildings like this? Not to glorify the Gilded Age or its values, but to understand our history fully, both its achievements and its failings. Mills Mansion is evidence, a primary source we can walk through that helps us understand how extreme wealth was accumulated, displayed, and eventually shared. The mansion's future is both secure and uncertain. Secure because it's protected as a state historic site with legal preservation requirements. Uncertain because funding is always precarious, political priorities shift, and climate change threatens historic buildings in ways we're only beginning to understand. There are questions about interpretation's future. How will the next generation understand this place? Will they see it primarily as architectural achievement, social history, evidence of inequality, educational resource, all of these simultaneously? The answers will shape how Mills Mansion is presented and what lessons visitors take away. There are also questions about physical preservation. The mansion is over 120 years old. Materials deteriorate, systems fail. Each generation of preservationists must decide how much to restore versus stabilize, when to replace versus repair, how to balance authenticity with functionality. Climate change poses particular challenges. More extreme weather threatens building envelopes. Changing temperature and humidity patterns affect historic materials in ways they weren't designed to withstand. Increased flooding risk from the Hudson River could threaten grounds and outbuildings. Adaptation will be necessary, but perhaps Mills Manson's most important legacy is the questions it provokes. Every visitor leaves thinking about wealth, power, inequality, beauty, history, and how we choose to remember the past. Those questions don't have easy answers, and that's precisely what makes them valuable. The mansion stands not as monument to be admired uncritically, but as text to be read carefully, interpreted thoughtfully, and learned from deeply. It's evidence of both what humans can achieve and what we shouldn't aspire to. It's beautiful and troubling, impressive and problematic, worthy of preservation and worthy of critique. Henry Clay Frick built a monument to launder his reputation. The Mills family built a mansion to cement their social position, but both understood something important: architecture outlasts intentions. Buildings become what future generations make of them, not what their builders hoped they'd be. Mills Mansion today is neither pure celebration of Gilded Age elegance nor simple condemnation of Gilded Age excess. It's something more nuanced, a preserved piece of American history that asks us to think complexly about beauty and justice, wealth and worth, past and present. On the banks of the Hudson River, where water flows both ways with the tide, where American history runs as deep as the river channel, stands a mansion that reflects our complicated relationship with wealth and power, beautiful but built on inequality, elegant but excluding, preserved but problematic. And perhaps that's exactly what we need, not monuments that tell us what to think, but spaces that require us to think for ourselves. Not history simplified into heroes and villains, but history presented in its full complexity, inviting engagement rather than passive acceptance. Mill's mansion endures. Not as the Mills family intended, their private retreat is now public property, but as something potentially more valuable, a space where we can confront uncomfortable questions about who we were, who we are, and who we want to become. The rooms are quiet now. The servants are gone. The wealthy owners who once commanded these spaces exist only in photographs and documents. But the questions remain, echoing through marble halls and wood, paneled libraries. Who builds monuments? Who gets remembered? What do we preserve and why? Can beauty justify the means of its creation? How do we honor architectural achievement while acknowledging the social systems that made it possible? And when we walk through these rooms, when we admire these views, when we appreciate this elegance, what are we really celebrating? Mill's Mansion doesn't answer these questions, but by existing, by opening its doors to all, rather than just the privileged few, by inviting us to look closely and think deeply, it helps us ask them more intelligently. And perhaps that's the only kind of legacy that really matters, not the one you build deliberately, but the one that emerges when your monument becomes everyone's story, when your private space becomes public memory, when your attempt at immortality transforms into something you never imagined. The mansion stands, the river flows, the questions endure.